We also welcome the support of the International Climate Initiative and the Federal Ministry of the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety of Germany. We would like to give you a brief introduction of GES. GES is an initiative started by a group of early career researchers on the field of ecosystem services. The primary aim of this group is to stimulate an exchange of ideas, identify knowledge gaps, and improve possibilities for training and capacity building in relation to ecosystem services, science, and practice. This network aims to achieve actual cooperation, explore ideas for innovative research, and to gain experience of critical thinking and science communication. Over the last years, the science policy interface has become more and more important with our organization, which can be seen, for example, in the GES delegation to IPBES of World Biodiversity Forum. In my case, I had the opportunity to participate in IPBES 6 in Medellin, Colombia. Thank you very much. Nina, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Yeah, my name is Nina Kaiser, and I just want to say a few sentences that underline the urgency of the topic. For us as early career researchers, this area of collaboration is becoming increasingly important because we realize more and more that there is a real need for an effective communication and mutual exchange between the two fields of science and policy. The scientific findings on species decline and the loss of functioning ecosystems with the negative effects on our human well-being are well known within the scientific community and partly beyond. But how do we bring this knowledge into action? How do we achieve together the transformation needed to ensure the human well-being and the future of our planet? How can we as early career researchers make our contribution to solving these global issues that play at regional and national levels and in different contexts of development policy with different challenges? We already have learned a lot yesterday how science can shape policy. And today we are looking forward to the panel discussion on researchers' experience in this field. And we are curious about the success factors that play a key role for an effective collaboration in the science policy interface. So we wish all participants an inspiring event, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina and Giovanni, for the opening remark. Now we're going to move on to the introductory speaker. She is Dr. Juliette Young, a professor at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And while on sabbatica, she is lecturing at the Université de Boulogne-Franche-Comté in France, where she's currently undertaking a fellowship on conflict transformation in agricultural systems. So she has been involved in understanding and improving science policy interface for over 15 years, initially managing the EU-funded SPIRA project, and then as the coordinator of the Horizon 2020 Eclipse project. So she has also been involved in national science policy initiatives as well as international initiatives, including IPBES. So as a national expert on the catalog of policy support tools and methodologies, and more recently on the ongoing scoping of the transformative change assessment. So she's also on the ATANET management board responsible for science policy interface. So without further ado, I'll be handing over to Juliette to set the scene for the panel discussion today on how scientists can address the needs of policy makers. So over to you, Juliette. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for introducing me and also for inviting me today. It's a real honor to have this opportunity to share with you some of my experiences at the Science Policy Interface. I don't know if you can see my screen properly. Great. Okay. So just to sort of kick off the discussions today, I was asked to give a presentation on what is policy relevant research in the field of biodiversity conservation and how should such research be conducted and made accessible to policymakers. Now, answering the first question is only going to take one slide. Because from my perspective, biodiversity conservation implies human action, and so potentially all biodiversity conservation research is policy relevant. But there are two buts here. The first issue is that often as researchers or as scientists, we develop research that we think should be interesting or should be integrated into policy. But actually, it isn't relevant either at that time or in the format that we envisage. So be it in the way in which we are formulating the question or the way in which we hope to answer it. So in other words, all too often, there is a tendency for us to try and sort of force our research into policy processes, a little bit like forcing a square peg into a round hole, as these individuals are down here. And whilst we might think that this gives us some sort of purpose, it can be incredibly frustrating for researchers who want to engage in the SPI and can't, because that relevance isn't quite applicable at that stage. There's also the issue that not all researchers involved in biodiversity conservation need to engage in science policy interfaces for all aspects of their research. So bearing these two buts in mind, for the rest of the presentation, I will focus on how SPIs work and also how researchers can get engaged in these processes. Now, just as a very, very quick introduction to science policy interfaces, or SPIs, for me and for colleagues that I worked with during the Spiral project, SPIs are really all the ways in which scientists, policymakers, and other actors link up to communicate, exchange ideas, and very importantly, develop knowledge jointly in order to enrich policy and decision-making processes and/or research. Now, just a very quick aside on knowledge, on what we mean by knowledge in this context. The knowledge really is sort of socially constructed, with scientific knowledge being only one form of knowledge amongst many others. And that knowledge is really shaped through interactions, through context, through different forms of knowledge, etc. Knowledge can be used in very different ways. And in the policy-making context, three sort of main uses, if you like, have been highlighted. Instrumental knowledge, which is the sort of direct use of facts seen as knowledge in order to fill gaps or uncertainties. Conceptual knowledge, which is really there to sort of change the way in which we sort of think about things, and strategic or instrumental strategic knowledge or political knowledge that can be used to push certain agendas. Now, although the above slides have sort of highlighted what SPIs are, it's also quite important to stress what SPIs are not. And here, for just this slide, I'm going to engage in a bit of sort of myth busting on science policy interfaces, just to be very clear for the rest of the presentation. So science and policy are not independent domains of human activity. SPIs are not about this sort of one-way flow in which science speaks truth to power, in this case policy, and SPIs are certainly not simple fora through which reporting of science leads to the development of policy through optimization in these sort of clear, controllable, and unproblematic ways. The reality is that SPIs are often very messy and can be quite difficult to navigate, but the positive is that challenges around SPIs are now quite well known. So the first one, of course, is that as researchers working on biodiversity conservation, we're dealing with environmental issues that are very complex and deal with complex socio-ecological systems. In addition, scientific experts are not always the best place to communicate their work, and scientific work can get distorted, for example, through the media or other indirect routes. In addition, the policy context or policy setting is often quite complex, with multiple possible entry points, making it quite difficult for researchers to know where they can contribute and how. We also have a situation where there are quite a lot of silos still, both in terms of scientific disciplines, but also in terms of policy sectors, again, making it difficult to see where our research can fit. There can also be very different worldviews and values, both within science and policy, but also between science and policy. And these obviously need to be need to be acknowledged. And there are inevitable trade-offs when, as scientists, we engage in science policy interfacing work. So there's the sort of clarity-complexity trade-off, you know, the sort of simple messages versus the communicating uncertainty and complexity, etc. There's the speed-quality trade-off, so timely outputs versus in-depth quality assessments. The push-pull trade-off in terms of supply and demand-driven research, but also very importantly, the personal time trade-off. So interfacing takes a lot of time and energy, and that's obviously time taken away from doing other things that quite a few sort of structures, academic structures at the moment, might value more than interfacing work. So with all these challenges in mind, the sort of question is, well, actually, why bother engaging at all in science policy interfaces, because it seems like a lot of complicated and difficult work ahead. But the fact is that, you know, there's this huge amount of science out there that's potentially really useful to policy but underused, and I think a lot of us feel that science should be used more and better in policy making. There's increasingly an accountability issue with funders increasingly demanding policy impact. So we can't carry on necessarily working in our little bubbles anymore. Sometimes there really is that accountability issue. Engagement in science policy processes do give researchers a better awareness of what research is policy relevant. And so therefore there's like a sort of virtuous circle, which means that it increases funding competitiveness. And also, based on my own personal experience, engaging in science policy interfacing work can be hugely satisfying when everything, you know, goes well, and also it can be very, very challenging, but hopefully usually in a really, really good way. Right, the positives, the first positive really of SPIs is that we do know now what a sort of ideal science policy interface should contain and should look like, right? And this is some work that we did as part of the Spiral project. And so it starts with the sort of blue bubble at the top, with this sort of joint consideration between science and policy of the audiences, the policy context and the needs of policy, goal-oriented strategies and expected impact of the SPI. Then this would lead, ideally, obviously, to ongoing opportunities for and process of exchange and learning between science and policy, so that you get to a science policy interface which is fit for purpose, it's able to reach a target audience in timely and effective ways in order to maximize influence. During all of this time, the idea is that you're developing a common language, you're building trust, you're developing capacities to understand each other's positions, views, needs, and constraints, and you get to knowledge, process, and influence and impacts that are credible, relevant, and legitimate. And of course, it doesn't end there. You always, you know, have to have this sort of regular stock taking to ensure that everything is still going to plan, and obviously lead to improvements of that SPI. Now, this is what we've been doing over the last 4, actually maybe nearly 5 years now, through the Eclipse project, where we've been building this mechanism that tries to mirror a lot of these aspects of the ideal SPI in order to really sort of address the needs of decision makers through synthesis of knowledge that can then be taken to them. And this, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail of the whole process. There's a lovely video of it on our website, and I would really encourage you to look at our website. But I'm going to sort of talk about sort of 2 aspects of this cycle that I think are particularly relevant in successful SPIs. The first one is the need to scope and frame research with decision makers directly, rather than assuming what they want or should need. So here, the idea is to take quite a bit of time sometimes at the beginning or ahead of any research in order to understand the knowledge needed by decision makers, for what purposes, in what time scale, and with which resources. Now, this is just an example of the way in which we did that for a request that was put to us by IUCN and the Swedish Board of Agriculture. And initially, their question was really about a general issue of improving the biodiversity outputs of greening measures in the Common Agricultural Policy. And really through this scoping and framing process, we managed to sort of focus more on understanding farmer uptake of the most promising greening measures in the CAP. So this process, if you like, of framing and scoping with policy and other decision makers, it ensures an understanding of the policy or societal need. It can also provide an opportunity for communicating what research can and can't do. So there are simply questions formulated in such a way that we just can't answer in the way that policymakers might want us to. And that obviously needs to be clarified. Deciding jointly on research questions, on approaches, and very importantly on outputs. So we might think that a 500-page report with all the information in there is what the decision maker will need, but actually it might not be at that particular time. They might need completely different outputs, but it's useful to scope that with them initially rather than to expect, rather than to presume what they're wanting. But all of this requires regular stock taking to be sure that we're always on the same page and not sort of veering off into a direction that isn't the one where the decision makers want us to go. The second key point for me for a sort of successful SPI is that we need to get a lot more familiar is really breaking down these silos to ensure the engagement of the most relevant knowledge holders across scientific disciplines, of course, but also with practitioners and local knowledge holders who can input their knowledge into this process, and also from all relevant geographic areas. So we need to really have processes that really embrace this and actually sort of make us engage with this in a much more holistic way. And this is what we do in the Eclipse project, where for every request we receive from decision makers, we have an open call for knowledge and an open call for experts to ensure that we really get the best possible knowledge holders to respond to these requests from decision makers. But of course, there's still a huge amount that we can do. As a sort of community of researchers, there really is a need to sort of build on and use existing interfaces. So there are fantastic science policy interfaces at the national level, at the EU level, like Ecology, like Automate, etc., and also obviously at the global level, like IPBES. Really trying to encourage a lot more flexibility and diversity, so trying to break down these silos that often impede science policy interfaces, develop a real culture of science policy society interaction, so that this becomes part of our normal day job rather than an extra activity that we do on the side. Concepts, real sort of need to train in science policy and science society interactions. There are always new sort of methods, approaches, etc. that come in, and it's really useful to have that training and capacity building in it. Demonstrate the usefulness of interaction, so really convince by example. So especially if you're struggling to sort of convince, your bosses or whatever of the science policy work that you do, really just show them, what examples you have and try and convince through that way. Another massive thing that these examples are going to provide is to help shift the reward system in academia to recognize interface work much, much better and much more. And also always address some of these myths about science by increasing transparency. So we as researchers might think that the policy world is quite complex, but others outside academia might think that research is quite complex and opaque as well. And it's our job to make that transparent and accessible, not just to decision makers, but also to societal actors. As individual researchers, there's of course a huge amount that we can do all the time. We can always get to know the policy world better. There are loads of different opportunities like workshops and meetings and field trips. Okay, we can't really do a lot of face-to-face meetings at the moment. But I'm sure the time will come again. Internships, job shadowing, really to recognize constraints and differences, but also to increase understanding and trust of people who work in policy. And also, of course, improving communication. It doesn't necessarily have to be us all the time. There are brilliant brokers, linkers, translators, etc. out there who can help. But it's really about adapting approaches to your audience, finding that policy hook and also that policy window. so that you can actually sort of contribute at the right time. Contextualizing your findings is really important, and sort of really clear messages using lots of different and tailored, very importantly tailored communication tools. And just to finish off, really, a few sort of personal lessons that I've learned from working at the Science Policy Interface. Obviously motivation is really important, as are resources. And I was really lucky because I had the support of my line managers to do SPI work, and I really appreciate that. A lot of flexibility and adaptability, and accepting that it won't always go as planned. But sometimes that's actually a really good thing. So again, that flexibility is hugely useful. Creativity and thinking outside the box in science policy interfaces is often very, very much needed. And just really being open to others' worldviews, values, and constraints. Because it's true that we don't work necessarily in the same systems, and it's important to know and respect that. Embracing the messiness of science policy, etc., is also key, and I would say that humility and a good sense of humor also goes a very, very long way when engaging in SPIs. So just to finish, I would say that it's really up to you as individual young researchers to engage in the science policy interface work if you like. And if you do decide to become engaged, then please make the most of the resources and initiatives out there. And certainly within the Eclipse community, we'd be delighted to hear from you and obviously to support you in any way we can. So thank you again very much for inviting me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Juliette, for the very insightful presentation. So now we're going on to the panel discussion, and this will be moderated by Queenette and Abisha. So Queenette and Abisha, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Izzy. So Queenette and myself are going to moderate this session. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Abisha Mapendembe. I work as a program officer in the Ecosystem Assessment and Policy Support Program at the United Nations Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center based in Cambridge, working mainly on a number of intergovernmental agreements and processes and supporting effective decision-making within those agreements. And my co-moderator is going to be Queenette. Queenette, maybe you can introduce yourself and just proceed to also introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Queenette Princess Johnson. I'm from Liberia, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Felix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire. I'm doing my master's in Biodiversity Conservation and Ecosystem Services. Thank you. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce Kai Chen. He's a professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability, University of British Columbia. He led the Pathways and Solutions chapter of the recent IPBES Global Assessment and has published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals. As an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist, Kai leads Chen's lab. The acronym for that is Connecting Human and Natural System. And he is a lead editor of the new British Ecological Society journal, that's The People in Nature. Kai is co-founded also the Co-Sphere, a community of small planet heroes, which seeks to make it easy, endurable, and inexpensive for individuals and organizations to have net positive effects on nature and their many crucial contributions to people. Of course, Kai has a bunch of honors, but he didn't want to burden with a lot of reading, so I'm moving forward now to Ingunn. Okay, so Ingunn is the head of IPBES Technical Support Units on Capacity Building, that's TSU for short, where Ingunn has been working since it starts in 2015. She's the mother, as you would say, of the IPBES Fellowship Program, having supported and guided so far close to 100 early career individuals in their contributions across 9 different IPBES assessments. Prior to joining IPBES, Ingunn worked for over a decade at the intersection of climate change, carbon markets, and political science. She has an interdisciplinary academic background from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and London School of Economics, within environment and development. She has worked and lived in multiple countries. Now she is back in her birth town, that's Storrø, at the Norwegian Environment Agency, where the IPBES TSU is based, helping build capacities of individuals and institutions for a strengthened science policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Moving forward, Nicole de Paula. She is the founder of the Women's Leadership for Planetary Health and the inaugural awardee of the Carlos Stoffer Sustainability Fellowship at the Institute for Vine Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. For more than a decade, she has been globally connecting policymakers and researchers to create a public understanding on key issues related to sustainability, environment, and public health. Prior to her work in Germany, she was the director of a think tank in Bangkok, Thailand, hosted by Mahidol University at their Faculty of Public Health. As a planetary health advocate, she champions the socio-economic advancement for women through environmental conservation and public health policy to make the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development a reality by 2030. Originally from Brazil, Dr. Nicole holds a PhD in international relations from the Sciences Po Paris and has been consulting with several international organizations under the UN system on terms related to climate change, biodiversity, chemicals, financial, and urban affairs. Moving on to Denise Margaret Matias. She's a research scientist at the Institute for Social Ecological Research in Frankfurt in Germany, and a fellow of the Sustainable Use of Wild Species Assessment of IPBES. As an associate of the Non-Timber Forest Product Exchange Program, Asia, she regularly attends United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings as an observer. Denise's engagement in policy started in 2006 through an advocacy work with Greenpeace Southeast Asia and has shifted to the Science Policy Interface in 2010 as an Alexandra von Humboldt Foundation International Climate Protection Fellow in Germany. Last on our list of panelists is Celesta Malaki. She is a senior research scientist at the National Museum of Kenya, but she's not here at the moment. So thank you guys, and I'll move over now to Abisha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Queenette. And just to say, this session is going to focus on actually the researchers' experiences in contributing to the policy processes. You know, what are some of the successes, what are some of the challenges, and also they're going to share with us some of their tips and tactics on how to actually to engage with that. I must say, I'm actually delighted that we do have an impressive list of panelists who are at the core face of these science policy interfaces. And I'm sure you're also delighted, all the participants, that they're going to share with us the wealth of experience that they have on working on science policy interfaces. And I think what we're going to start to look at is to actually hear from each of the participants on their fabulous or less fabulous experiences actually of collaborating with policymakers. I mean, how did the collaboration started? I mean, if you did any research, you know, how did you formulate some of those research questions, the communications that was involved, the dissemination, and also what were the impacts? So I think I'm going to start with, I hope you have settled in, Professor Kai-chan. I think I'm going to start with you, if that's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds good to me. And just to, I was imagining that we had 10 minutes, but now I'm guessing that it's more like 5. Can you just confirm how much time I should take?
I think 5, that's the plan. But
yeah, that's what I thought.
We might actually squeeze, we might squeeze in an extra minute, but I think 5, let's work with 5. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
It's great to see you all this morning. I'm just going to jump straight in. So I want to tell a few stories, but of course I'm going to have to tell them a little faster than I was remembering, about different kinds of collaborations and how they came about and evolved. The first is with the Canadian federal government about ecosystem services with their ecosystem services toolkit that Susan Preston led. And then with 3 different jurisdictions, Costa Rica, Washington State, and British Columbia, where I live, about payments for ecosystem services programs. And then finally with Costa Rica and others about this idea of transformative change, where I deleted a space by accident. So the first of those collaborations actually came about because Susan Preston, to my great surprise, called me on my phone the day that this paper came out in Ecological Economics about payments for ecosystem services program. She wasn't even responsible for payments for ecosystem services programs at Environment Canada and Climate Change, but it was something that she was tracking. I actually might be misremembering which paper it was, but anyway, one of my papers, it came to her attention, and she called me and she said, you know, there's lots that we have in common in terms of our perspectives. Can you come on and help me with this ecosystem services toolkit? And so that toolkit was very much also aimed at the science policy interface. It was intending to help practitioners use science in their work in terms of better understanding and characterizing ecosystem services within mostly government settings, but also I think to a degree corporate. And it remains the most useful tool and framework that I know of. And this is giving credit to Susan Preston and to Chiara Rautzap-Hearn for their great work on it in terms of really getting actionable. But as I said, that came out because of a paper. Now, that same paper led a bunch of my graduate students, including Molly Chapman and Paige Olmsted and Adrian Semmelink, who passed away suddenly and unexpectedly a couple of weeks ago, to engage with policymakers in, as I said, Washington State, British Columbia, and in Costa Rica. And, you know, so in these cases, we were motivated by these ideas that we had expressed together, several of us, in this paper in Ecological Economics, about both how payments for ecosystem services programs articulate rights and responsibilities, which is a point that was first made by Arald Vatten, but also 6 other problems, including this trade-off between efficiency and equity in the kind of single-minded pursuit of small-scale additionality. And we articulated a vision for programs like this that might be actually more effective, more equitable, and more sustainable in the long term. And so these engagements with the policymakers were oriented around these ideas, which resonated in various ways with those policymakers. In every case, we had some kind of a collaboration with them, although it looked different in the 3 nations. In the case of Adrian and his work in British Columbia, he reached out to the Ministry of Agriculture, trying to better understand what their needs so that he could cater to them. Turns out they actually needed somebody to do work like what he was proposing, and wanted to tack on an extra, large chunk to the surveys and interviews that he was planning, in order for them to basically collaborate on this. So he ended, in his master's research, ended up doing a contract that was for the Ministry of Agriculture, and then was hired by that ministry based on the results that he came up with. The final of these stories is a kind of long and ongoing engagement at the broadest kind of global level of science policy interfaces. And that's IPBES, where engaging in the conceptual framework meeting in Cape Town in 2005 led to a bunch of us. So this meeting was an interesting one in response to arguments about, there's 2 different kinds of values that are relevant here. There's the instrumental and the intrinsic. And I'd just come out of conversations with Barbara Maraca and Terry Satterfield and Kurt Jacks and others, and just couldn't help but say, look, that's really not all there is to what matters to people and why they might engage with ecosystem services or conservation. And you have to consider all these other things that are more relational in nature. You might call them relational values. Barbara Maraca had used that term in a limited context. In that workshop, I ended up using it in a more expansive concept, including also human relationships, like responsibilities to other people that also include the environment. And that idea took off. It led, we then expanded the idea of relational values. It did find a place in the conceptual framework and has helped to orient the work of IPBES since then. And that ongoing engagement about relational values and about other aspects of transformative change got me hooked and involved in the global assessment process, where we developed these ideas around transformative change and what that might look like. And most recently, in terms of interactions with policymakers. So this has spun out into a range of different interactions with policymakers, including presenting to the House of Commons in Canada, but also with the Costa Rican government, because their national focal points wanted to better understand how they could advocate for transformative change within the Convention on Biological Diversity's ongoing processes to define their post-2020 framework for biodiversity. So I can't see my time, but I'm sure I must be at 5 minutes already. So just to
continue.
Just to wrap up there. Point here is, sometimes people argue that the first thing you ought to do is to get involved with policymakers. I don't actually necessarily agree with that. I actually think it's really important to go in with some ideas that are that you have defined for yourself through absorbing the literature about how these processes can really work better when you consider the problem most broadly. And then armed with that information, go into a conversation in particular places. Often that can come from, by the way, policy processes or science policy processes like IPBES, and then go into those conversations with decision makers so that you can both meet the needs of further developing this insight, as well as also meeting the on-the-ground realities. And in all of those aspects, I think it's absolutely crucial to remain focused on transformative change, because the interests of local decision makers is rarely that, but there's always an opportunity to make an intervention more transformative. So with that, I'll stop and pass it on to the next panelist.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Professor Chan. It's really fascinating stuff. And I think one of the most important thing also I've drawn out of that is that, all the things that you've done for those two kind of collaboration, they started actually small, one with a paper and a phone call, and look where it went. And even the second one with, this meeting in Cape Town, and came to IPBES involvement in assessment, and now it's even influencing, international policy processes like the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think that's also an important thing. I'm going to move to our next panelist to share experiences, Dr. Nicole, if that's fine with you.
Yes, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here. And I think it's a very difficult task after all these first inputs they said a lot. So I think now it's more, we can have a conversation about our experiences. And so I want to share more of a personal story. And I think it's for, especially if you are an early career researcher, this personal stories really help us to understand the struggles, because as we said at the beginning, it's not an easy process. And if you understand a little bit this struggle and how we develop in this field, it's kind of interesting. So I just have to begin. I remember being I was team leading a EU funded project, those typical ones. It was an FP7 funding before, and it was about climate adaptation in cities, actually. So not directly biodiversity, but of course connected. So it was a large consortium with 9 work packages. And at the beginning, and that's the important part, I did not believe that the importance of my own work package, which was governance. And it was, the most important that nowadays we do believe, and we know the importance of that. But at the beginning, since the project was being driven by natural scientists, as you mentioned, I have a PhD in international relations. I'm a lot of influence of political science. So when you had to deal, and it was coordinating a lot there from our perspective, but you have to deal with modelers and all these things, that how I am gonna do work with these people. So it was very scary, and it was a postdoc actually, so just after the PhD. So the research questions, of course, was, and I think we touched about this point, there was a lot of, in our specific work, we had to understand that beyond the modelings, that people were trying to understand the costs of adaptation in cities. So we have some cities as pilots, but our work was to really go and talk to these policymakers in the specific cities and understand, even if they were planning to have a climate adaptation plan for that city, which, because sometimes you already had the project to model the costs, but there was not even a plan, there's no data. So these things really helped. The qualitative aspect of this research was very interesting. So slowly, I started to get more confident about that process. And one thing that I really, it was really important, and I think was mentioned already, it was the importance of engaging stakeholders in that process. So we did have mechanisms that would, this co-creation of the problem, although I think, Kai, you mentioned that it's important to analyze these problems in a holistic manner, and if you do, perhaps what I understood, if you do have a very good analysis, you're probably going to come up with important contributions. But it's often, and I have other examples as well, when they, the scientists arrive in a field and they have already funding, and sometimes millions. And I'm just switching to another example. In Asia, I remember clearly, and they arrived there, said, oh, we are going to help you, the communities, with flooding, for example. And except that this was not a problem there. So they had really to reconsider the whole process. And it was like 4 million euros, invested in that. So this importance of this co-creative and really checking in the mutually supportive process seems to be one that it's very important. So back to the project, and I think you also asked how we communicated as a group and how these things were evolving. It was very interesting to analyze how every 4 and 6 months we would be together. Each work package would be responsible to organize, the collective. And I think the real lesson there is how you communicate your work. You've been working for 6 months on your work package. Then you have to go there and you have 7 minutes or 5 minutes to present that. So having this ability to synthesize your findings and perhaps adapt your language to the other colleagues that are working with you but don't have the same language of your discipline. That's an important talent that I think we learned a lot when you do interdisciplinary work. And just moving to the dissemination part of things, it was a very, I would say, traditional way that these projects work. We had a lot of outputs and different ones. And I think that was one of the important aspects, is that we also had a work package specifically of communication and experts in communication, and that sometimes tends to be missing. And as we mentioned also at the beginning, I think said that scientists are not the best to communicate their findings. And it's okay, because I don't think they need to become now the best people to do it. They should improve and gain certain skills. But it's also important to have in this consortiums people who are thinking about that as well. So at the end of the project, we have, beyond, of course, scientific reports, articles, I think, and book chapters, PhDs, and all that. But there was and webinars. We did a lot of webinars with the stakeholder dialogues, but there was specifically a training package for policymakers that could be more visually attractive, and a lot of, we had also a platform at the end with a lot of videos. It's completely different than when you're talking about papers, for example. So changing the language there, I think it was a really important lesson. So in the end, of course, the project, we are there to advise those cities, and they were producing evidence bases on the costs specifically of so many good examples in Europe and some in Latin America as well. But in the end, the decisions really stays with the decision makers. So it was a very good exercise that I had, that I would like to share this experience to begin with. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicole. I think another set of really fascinating experiences on science policy interface. I'm now going to move to Dr. Denise. Matias, if you could quickly share your examples as well, your experiences.
Yes, so thank you, and also thank you to Juliette, and Nicole for all the contributions. They were very interesting, and I will build upon that. So I've seen that the participants, we are more or less equal students and researchers. And I will give first an example of how I started in policy, as was mentioned earlier, in 2006 from an advocacy perspective. So I was, that time the climate youth movement was just starting, and it's quite different from what we have now. So now you have Greta and very young, but during that time we were around late teens and early 20s. So for those of you who are thinking yet, especially the students, whether you would like to in the future work for an NGO or research, the manner by which science or policy happens with NGOs is that we go to these big meetings. We do our share. If you're familiar with Greenpeace, of course, Greenpeace does a lot of actions. And an example in 2006 was when we went to the Asian Development Bank annual general meeting. So this is where all the finance ministers of Asia come together, decide, etc. And we were asking them to decarbonize their investment portfolio, meaning that please don't fund any more coal power plants. So us as youth, of course, we had all these actions. We were giving away ice cream, for example. And so it generated a lot of noise. So if you are from an NGO, you can do it. You can do these things. And impact-wise, it happened only in 2018 that ADB committed to decarbonizing their portfolio. So we can say that, I'm not sure, also thinking about what Juliette was mentioning about timeliness, but somewhat, if you are from an NGO, let's accept that there's also some impact. And I'm saying this because last week I was discussing with a friend, and then he was saying like, yeah, I think NGOs, they're like all heart but no brain compared to researchers who are all brain but no heart. So, you know, this is like probably something that we can discuss later on. And so when I shifted to the science policy, wherein I was representing more research perspective, the difference is first is with a degree of separation with the policymakers. So Juliette mentioned this earlier about brokers. And for me, I felt that when I was representing an NGO, I had more access to policymakers. It was easier compared to now. Although now we're with IPBES, I'm with IPBES, and it's a 3-year process of writing the assessment. So we only get to meet all the policymakers later on. However, the difference is that with how the policymakers actually view us and the reception. So for example, when I introduce myself as someone from the NGO, compared to when I introduce myself as a researcher with a PhD, for example, it's very different. So one feels that when you are coming from an NGO side, it feels as if, yeah, they will listen to you, but sometimes they take you lightly. But from the researcher perspective, they listen to you more and somewhat give you more time. So when Kai mentioned earlier about interacting with local decision makers and giving on-the-ground realities, I tried to do this in one of my researches back in the Philippines. And however, the relationship with the Department of Environment there was already established beforehand when I was still with the NGO. So again, going back to the point on brokers, the NGOs are very important actors as well to work with, because often they have this relationship, very long relationship with policymakers. So anyway, I finished my research and then was interacting with a biodiversity environment department, and it was a surprise because, of course, I was working then with giant honeybees, which were hunted by indigenous people. So the species is called Apis dorsata. This you only find in Asia. And so then I mentioned about my findings, etc. And then I would say, maybe it's also a question to all of you later, would you consider it a success that the policymaker listened to me? But in the end, she said to me, oh yeah, that's right. The giant honeybees are also considered wildlife. So this means that we also have to regulate them. So then that's a question. When we put out our research there, we cannot control what the decision makers would do with it afterwards. It's just that we provide the evidence base. Okay, there needs to be conservation for the giant honeybees, but we don't know how they will conserve it. So that for me was something that, oh no, I don't want to put those indigenous peoples who are benefiting from gathering honey and selling it, and then now there will be an added layer of regulation. So I guess these are one of the challenges for science policy that I've so far come across. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Denise. And I think what is really good is that you can see already there are a lot of commonalities and in some cases also some differences in terms of some of the really key sort of processes along that kind of research, evidence, decision making, and impact chain. And I think we're also going to now move to a very, very good example actually of sort of skills that may be needed by early career researchers and senior researchers, and also with some tips and tactics on how to build sort of research communities that are more familiar and equipped to work at the science policy interface. And Ingunn has got a fantastic actually example and experience from her work with TSU that she's gonna share with us. So over to you, Ingunn.
Thank you so much, Bisha, and thank you for inviting me here. It's been super interesting. I attended yesterday as well, and I must give my praise to the organizers for this, and also the fantastic panelists that spoke both yesterday and today. It's been really interesting and good, and I look forward to the future discussions as well. So I'm, as you said, with the Technical Support Unit on capacity building with IPBES, and one of the things that we do this fellowship program. So early career researchers or people are then allowed to take part in the assessment process in IPBES, and Denise, the previous speaker, is one of our proud fellows that we have in the sustainable use assessment, so that's good. And I know also that Kai has been working with some of our fellows as well as the coordinating lead author in the global assessment, etc. But to go to your first question, Nabisha, I think you wanted me to talk a bit about the different sort of skill set or qualities that early career researchers might want to look into when entering a science policy interface. Hilda was saying yesterday that there's no sort of school or education that you can take, and this is all a lot about trial and error. But I think there are some personal qualities that, because there's been a lot of examples already from the other speakers here, but if we should look at the personal qualities that you should have going into this science policy interface, and bearing in mind that I come from the more global science policy interface work, but I think that these skills can be used both on a regional or national or even local scale. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was to be that if you're an early career researcher and you want to go into this science policy interface, I think it's important to be open-minded and curious. So you need to like to work with other people. You need to like to learn about other topics, to learn about other new things and find common solutions. And you need to be able to put yourself in someone's shoes. One thing that we talk a lot about our fellows about is to be humble but fearless, and that means that you need to also understand that there are things that you probably don't know from your coming in with your expertise, but because the policy process is a craft in itself, right? And it takes years to master this. And it's not as easy to say that, well, if only the policymaker had read my academic article, this problem X would be solved, as has been showcased by several of the previous speakers. I think one also needs to be brave in a sense that you seek new situations and experiences. Ask the policymakers, you know, go out. IPBES has this scoping process, and Juliette was talking about the importance of scoping as well. It is a co-production. You need to know what the policymakers want to know about, and you need also to have, in IPBES we have both the scoping processes, we have external reviews, we have dialogues with policymakers, and the final dialogue, of course, at the plenary as well before the adoption of the summary for policymakers and the report itself. So in your case, I would ask the questions like, which issues are the policymakers struggling with, and how can your research help in answering those questions? Last but not least, I think it's important to be knowledgeable, of course, understand what the policymakers need, as I said, but also why and by when they need it. So this whole issue of timing, I think that was also brought up yesterday. And then, of course, how to write the key findings, how to communicate them, and then the knowledge on how the science policy interface itself works. And to learn that, even though there's not a school, I would then strongly recommend to join the IPBES fellowship program on that, because I do think that is really learning by doing. And I don't know if you want me to dive into a bit on that fellowship program as well, Abisha, or...
I think, yeah, it seems the clock is about to beat us, so I'm conscious, I think, yeah.
Well, unless I know that you had asked me earlier to go a bit into some practical examples from the fellowship program. So but I'm in your hands.
I think if we can just give a quick one, I think, just give a quick one.
Okay, so as with Kai did, I also have a couple of just slides. Let me see if I can share my screen with you guys.
Yeah, we can see them.
Perfect. So I just wanted to, this one shows that it's a program that we started in 2015. It's an integral part of the work that we do on capacity building in IPBES. It builds capacities of fellows in undertaking assessments and being part of this science policy interface, and then creating a pool of experts that, of course, from a IPBES point of view, we would like them to come back, and we've seen examples of that, to take part as lead authors or coordinating lead authors, or even maybe co-chairs one day, but also to bring that knowledge back to their own home countries and institutions. This program comprises of really outstanding early career individuals from all backgrounds and disciplines. It's highly competitive to get in, and we of course select on merit, but also we try to have a balance on gender, on geography, and on disciplines. We provide training and mentoring opportunities. It is an unpaid fellowship, but for fellows from certain countries, we also cover travel costs. So that's good. And we also have this fellow alumni network. I have one more picture because this is sort of the family album. I just wanted to showcase these sort of really smiley people and faces. We have a lot of fun. The fellows take part from A to Z in the process as authors in an assessment. We now have fellows close to 100 in 9 different assessments and 1 task force. We have, I mentioned the mentoring opportunities where each fellow is paired with a mentor. So that leads to that. It's usually an experienced author or researcher that's part of the IPBES assessment. And it's great for networking, publications, experiences in social or the science policy interface, and the personal one-to-one mentoring mentee relationships. When it comes to practical examples, we have these training courses once a year where we do a lot of knowledge exchange, especially on work culture, the challenges that you were talking about, Nicole, on being part of this interdisciplinary teams. I must applaud like the fellows and the first fellows that we had in 2015, because they came in. It's not always easy with being young, being put into a group of really experienced experts that are sitting there, very acclaimed in their own fields. And then you have to deal with that on top of everything else. So finding that way for those fellows there was really something that they did very well, and they did such an impressive job that the number of fellows per assessment afterwards increased. It strengthens the bond between the fellows. We support, help each other. The fellows themselves are an extra resource, and I'm sure that that Denise can talk a bit about that as well afterwards. We pair old fellows with new fellows, etc. We do training on specific training on, for instance, graphics that was mentioned earlier today. You know, how do you communicate? Do you communicate through videos? How do you communicate your findings? And we find that by doing graphics, so graphs or figures, is a very useful way. So we encourage the fellows to take part in that creative process of finding out how to draw and present. And then also how to write for policy and decision makers. We've done a bit of capacity building on both for the fellows, but also for the coordinating lead authors and the co-chairs, so the more experienced authors in the or experts in the assessments. So we have like a summary for policymakers workshops that we've had, because it's really not easy trying to communicate something complex and in a different language to policymakers. And last but not least, the last example is that we had training in with the plenary meeting in Medellin in Colombia, IPBES 6. We brought all the fellows there. And this is really where the science policy interface happens in action. We had live commentary as it happened, you know, like on WhatsApp. We were sitting there when you have the dialogue between the experts up on stage with the policymakers in the room, and we were commenting. We also had debriefs afterwards with experienced policymakers in the corners, what happened, etc. So I think that by taking part in both the writing, but also that extra network and group feeling that you get of being that in a fellowship program like this, it really opens doors, and you can bring that with you back home to your own home country as well. So in that sense, I would really encourage everyone on this call to apply when we have new upcoming assessments coming out.
Thank you very much to our panelists for sharing really interesting experiences on the science policy interfaces that they've been involved with. I'm conscious that time, and I know my co-moderator had a question that she was going to ask, but I'm conscious of time. Maybe we move to the question and answer session, and that's the first question that was going to be asked, because I know you've already touched on that Ingunn, on the advice for early career researchers who would like to engage with SPIs. I think you've already touched quite a number. So I think I'm just going to hand over to the team that is going to moderate the question and answer session on the panel discussion. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we have quite a couple of questions in the Q&A session. So thank you again to all the panelists for the wonderful discussion. So now I'm handing over to Pascal Abalus, and Maria will be handling the Q&A section.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Easy. We have a lot of questions, and some of the questions are addressed to Dr. Young. The first question is from one of the participants who want to know how can we best work Shilo between science, it means biodiversity researcher, and the market, industry, or supply chain. Don't know if you get the point.
Yeah, sure. So this is the question about breaking down the silos between science and the sort of industry and supply chains. So I think for this one, I would say that there is quite a bit going on already in trying to sort of link up these two dimensions more. So the sort of two examples that I can think of, just like this, are the Natural Capital Coalition that do quite a lot of work in that, and there are opportunities to feed in to some of their initiatives. And I know that recently, for example, they developed some biodiversity guidance that's actually aimed specifically at the business sector. And that's obviously something that that researchers can feed into. And also at the European level, there's this European Business and Biodiversity Campaign that again aims to really sort of link up these two dimensions that are, of course, absolutely key. But in essence, I think that a lot of what I presented in terms of the interface between science and decision makers applies both to policy but also to business. So, you know, yes, it's obviously a slightly sort of different group of stakeholders, but they are, you know, they are a group that, as researchers, we can and do link up with, and there are sort of, you know, the approaches that work in terms of science policy also work in terms of science and societal actors such as businesses. So I would actually say that quite a lot of the sort of approaches that we use in science policy interfaces are completely applicable to the business sector as well. And also a huge amount of businesses now are integrating conservation and biodiversity, etc., within their plans. So obviously there's a debate about how well they're doing that and whether they could do it better, but there is definitely an engagement from them about how to do it. So I'm finding, for example, that more and more I'm invited to events organized by the business community, who are increasingly needing to see how they can better integrate biodiversity within their working plans.
Okay, thank you. I think there is another question for you. Someone is asking if you have any examples where institutes of learning have shifted towards becoming more accepting of researchers with science policies rather than focusing on advising science.
Yeah, so I think actually this is a real positive, over the last sort of 15 years or so since I've been working on this, there is definitely now more of a recognition within institutes that I know of, either universities or research institutes, of the advantages or the benefits of working at the science policy interface. So increasingly some sort of measures of sort of success of these research institutes is policy impact, and obviously working at the science policy interface can really sort of contribute to that policy impact. So I would say that generally there has been a huge improvement in that regard, certainly in the institutions that I've worked in terms of recognizing and supporting science policy work. But of course, I would say that it could be even better. That would be I would say that it has improved greatly already.
Thank you, Dr. Juliette. We have a question from Julia Isis. She says, most of your photos shows people working closely together. So do you have experience or of ideas for how to engage with stakeholders in this new COVID time? Maybe tools or strategies?
Yeah, so it is definitely an extra challenge to have to deal with. But certainly I've been on the phone with a few sort of decision makers that I know and that I keep in touch with. I haven't, it's true that it is maybe, I don't know, for me it's maybe a bit more awkward sort of having sort of video conferences with them necessarily, but I have continued being in touch with them despite all these different rules and constraints. So it is maybe more difficult, especially if you don't know them yet. Sort of cold calling them might be a little bit extreme, but there are definitely sort of opportunities to carry on contacting certainly the decision makers that you know, just to sort of update and etc. And really carrying on cultivating those personal contacts, or even making them. And I really liked Ingunn's comment earlier that it does require being a bit brave and sort of looking up who might be interested and actually going on, contacting them, etc. But in a way, maybe COVID is helping in that request. Maybe it's a bit easier to pick up the phone and call someone who you think might be interested in your work, rather than trying to organize a meeting with them. So I wouldn't have sort of specific tools or strategies to offer, but I definitely think that there might actually be opportunities in this sort of COVID world to make that first contact maybe a little bit easier.
Can I compliment something on that, if that's okay? Because I think that's a very important point. We're talking about normally the advice that we keep giving to young researchers: you have to go there, you have to build your network, you have to create trust. But during this moment, and it's not something that is going to end in a few months, we know that it's very important perhaps to develop this, to be this digitally influencers, not in the social media size, but definitely being able to. And I think on that aspect, there is definitely a lot of much more opportunities now, especially for the youth, to engage with so many international conferences that were inaccessible before, because you don't have funding to go and travel, and you have to pay hotels and all this. So now they can totally take active part in these international conferences digitally. So I think now there is little excuse to not participate into this process, especially internationally. And I'm hearing from a lot of youth coalitions that how this open new doors. So I think that's it's a very important thing. Another example that perhaps helps is not only being, of course, creative, visually, visual tools to explain your research with more digestible like videos or photos. Always helps to make your to send your message. But another example that happened to me that was very interesting and connects to this pandemic is that at the beginning, I do a lot, my main topic is now what we call planetary health. So it's really this connection between health and environment, that before the pandemic, it was a lot of people in the sustainability aspect, or even of course in biodiversity, said, oh, we don't do health. And now with the pandemic, you see the more intelligent breaking the silos approach, because that's the main problem that we have been seeing. That's not a new problem, that breaking the silos, that's something that I go through every conference. Everybody says we need to break the silos. And then I ask them, how do we break the silos? And then I'm working on a book now, and the title was Breaking the Silos. So because that's a key question. But the reason is, why do we even have silos? That's the first question we need to pose. Definitely they help us to digest such a complex information, and we need the silos in one hand. Of course, they will not completely disappear. But what we need, and I believe that these people who are interested in science policy dialogues, they need to be able to circulate and what I call cross-pollinate knowledge in these different areas. And this helps to break the silos, because maybe not everyone will break the silos, but you do need certain amount of people or institutions that can bring this information all together. And I think nowadays also is very important. We've talked about a lot of peer-reviewed papers, but with this pandemic, we saw how much information needs to be accelerated. And for example, blogs or other tools can be very influential. And I wrote a lot at the beginning of this pandemic because it was my topic. So I think I had the first intuitive things to say about COVID, because I was hearing before the pandemic. And then everybody wants to talk to you. Then the embassy in, the German embassy in Egypt called, they organized a whole event based on a blog. So I think it's very important. We shouldn't underestimate also the power of these other tools of communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole and Juliette. So we have 2 questions. This is for Ingunn. Are the fellowships application open for all people around the world? And how can we apply?
Yes, so it's open for people from all over the world. It's indicatively for those under 35. But we also have examples of some fellows that are above 35 years old. So it's not like completely closed, but we prefer, it's an early career researcher or fellowship. You can apply when the next assessment will start, and there's two assessments or two scoping reports that will be brought to the next IPBES plenary that will take place in June 2021. And then that's one scoping report on the Nexus assessment. That is a thematic assessment on the interlinkages among the biodiversity, water, food, and health in the context of climate change. That's very interesting. And then there's another scoping report on an assessment for transformative change that Kai has been very pivotal in working on. And that's a thematic assessment on the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, determinants for transformative change, and options for achieving the 2050 vision for biodiversity. So very exciting topic as well. If those two scoping reports are go through the plenary, and the plenary says that yes, please let's go ahead and start with these two new assessments. They will start right after the plenary, and then we will send out a call, and that goes out on the IPBES web page, ipbes.net. You can also sign up to be on the mailing list there. We put more information also on the fellowship if you go in on ipbes.net, you click on capacity building, and then you find a link to fellowship program on your left-hand side. You can read a bit more about it now. We will also post information there. But I would recommend just go to the IPBES website, make a user there. It takes you 2 minutes. Tick the box that you would like to be on the email list, and then you will automatically receive it. We also work quite hard with our partners to spread the information as wide as possible, because we really want to reach every corner of the world. What you need is, I see there's a question, I can answer that right away. If it's only for PhD students, no, it's not. But we have a few fellows that have finished their masters. We have most of them have started their PhD or their postdocs, so they're finished. But that's sort of the group of people that we're looking for.
Thank you, Ingunn. So, Pascal, do you have more questions?
Yes, there is a question for Professor Chen. Someone is asking, to which extent is active collaboration not the only dimension to interaction between researcher and policymaker? And what is the importance of continuous conservation in bringing science into the policy making process? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question, Nada. Thank you. The point there is that what I was trying to illustrate with my various examples is the importance of coming in to those kind of, constrained direct relationships with policymakers, and then back out to also reflect. And I really think that combination is super important, because when you're right there on the ground, you are in a constrained setting. There are only particular ways that a decision maker can apply the kind of knowledge that you can bring to bear. But in that process, you're learning about contexts more generally. And when you back up and then you survey a variety of different interactions with policymakers, then you have the opportunity for more general insights that can contribute to a wide range of different conversations. And IPBES and other, more general science policy interfaces are really good for that, I think, in terms of allowing that kind of broader perspective that also can build the way towards those more concrete interactions on the ground. Should I also answer the other question from anonymous attendee about relational values while I'm on?
Yes, you can. Yes.
Yeah, so there's a great question here about relational values and how, in the context of massive deforestation of pristine places, do we see opportunities for relational values as a paradigm or theory to help with mainstreaming biodiversity and preventing its destruction? It's a really good question. And the point here is to recognize that values don't do work on their own, right? So from our research and the research in many other groups about relational values, it's clear that a lot of people have pretty strong relational values that could, in theory, lead to the strong protection of biodiversity and ecosystem services and to transformations towards sustainability. The challenge is they also have other values, right? And the institutions that are currently in place tend at the moment to yield the enhancement of the other values at the moment, right? And I think that the example of the US election is a really great one, where at the moment we've got social media platforms. If you haven't seen the documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma, I highly encourage it. So where you've got these social media platforms that are exacerbating these tribal and kind of, tribal, territorial, these oppositional kind of values that we have that have yielded this most polarized of ever elections, because these two different parties see each other as enemies, right? And it's breeding the worst in people, bringing out the worst in people, rather than allowing us to express, the values that we have of camaraderie and of responsibility, etc. So to recap on that, the argument there is to think about how you can change institutions in order to bring out the kind of relational values that are consistent with sustainability. And that paper that I mentioned at first about payments for ecosystem services programs is one way of doing that, where all 7 of the suggested shifts are all about bringing out relational values more lively.
Okay,
Thank
you. This is another question for Dr. Denise. Someone is about to know how your experience presenting about honeybees to policymakers has changed the way you approach policymakers.
Okay, so I quite lost it. I think it's here. I was looking at it. So for the honeybees, as I've mentioned earlier, I was quite lucky to be in a position that I was already friends with the government officials. And however, the process by which I became friends with them took a lot of years. It was first and foremost because they had a research need, and within the Department of Environment, they didn't have the expertise. So I was with a group. We were doing volunteer work of mapping caves and just mapping caves for conservation purposes and also ecotourism, etc. And so we had a lot of experience going to the field with the government officials. So I think the takeaway from here is that first and foremost, epistemological humility. We have to know the limits of our knowledge, but we also have to know where we can contribute. So what our expertise is. And for us, that was our expertise, and we were able to contribute to the government officials. We were able to fulfill a need. And from there, we were able to establish really long-lasting relationships with them, to the point that they trusted us. They could come to us anytime. They will come to us anytime if they needed anything related to caves, or in my case, when I was already doing research on honeybees. So again, as was already mentioned earlier by Juliette and Nicole, if you know that you can contribute within the limits of your knowledge, of course, feel free to approach your government officials. Yeah.
Can I just complement that one as well, since I think it's a very important point you're bringing, because these relationships take time to be built, right? We cannot give the false impression that contact your government official and they will listen to you. They will not, probably not. And I mean, even academics probably will not give you enough attention, if they are so busy. So what is really important is to build this trust. It's really accept that it takes time, and there I think being coherent and being present in these activities and building your own network and improving, of course, the quality of your work really helps. I just want to share quickly one example of my personal life, and it was very interesting because at the CBD, I was an intern there, and more than 10 years ago, and that was, I think, was a successful internship. At the moment, you don't know what's going to happen, and it's very interesting to see that I could keep this relationship with at all levels at CBD, for example. And today, these people at the Women Leaders for Planetary Health, this organization that I founded, we have as one of our advisors, the former executive secretary of CBD, Braulio Dias, was from Brazil. I'm from Brazil, so it was a connection there. But it took 12 years that we see some, let's say, fruitful cooperation more directly. So it's a very interesting to take the time to do that.
Okay.
Sorry, Pascal, can I just compliment that as well very quickly? Is that also we have to take into account another challenge of the policy world, which is that they often have a very high turnover of people working in the policy sector, and so it might be, as Nicole says, that you take a very long time building that relationship, and you think you've got there. And then, they leave that post and go to another post where you don't really have that link anymore, and they're working on something completely different, and that's that. But it's not. I would really say it's not the first time it happens. You feel a bit desperate, and you're just like, why did I invest all this time? But actually, it is a really, really good investment, because you've learnt already a lot from that relationship that you've built. But also, invariably, at some point or another, they might come back into a role that is actually completely relevant to what you're doing. And that's happened to me quite a few times, actually, where, I've built a relationship with a decision maker who's gone to another post. I haven't really heard from them in sort of 6-7 years, whatever. And then suddenly they're back, either in a similar post or in a department where, there's possibility to link up, etc. And also the advantage with building up that trust is that they can then sort of let their successor know about you or about your work, etc. And that successor already has someone that they don't know yet, but know that they can trust and that they can work with, etc. So you can actually, do that sort of trust building with the next person maybe a bit quicker than you did with the first. So I just sort of, again, a small word of caution that there is often a very high turnover, but that's not necessarily a complete loss for any of us.
Thank you, Dr. Juliette, for your contribution. This may be the last question, I think, for Dr. Denise. Someone wants to know if there is any challenge, any specific challenge with navigating with science policy interface in Southeast Asia. So you are welcome to answer this question. Thank you.
Yes, so as you all know, there is sort of an EU in Southeast Asia. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we tried before at least to engage, or I was asking also the NGOs that I was working with, can we not try to influence ASEAN? The problem is ASEAN is not as hard. It's not as hard as the EU, meaning that everything is done by consensus, and they don't want to be political to the point that they would release a really controversial statement. So most of the time, those who are engaging with policy on the ASEAN level or the Association of Southeast Asian level would be just having to go through specific NGOs or specific policymakers and then putting them together. So this is, for those of you who are following the climate change processes, this would be the Climate Vulnerable Forum. The last time, I think, was it last year, they were only able to release a statement as Climate Vulnerable Forum members from Asia, but not on an ASEAN level. So because it's consensus-based and of course, and non-controversial in Southeast Asia. So far, that's the issue there.
Thank you for your contribution, Dr. Denise. Dr. Easy?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I think we have one very last question.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. The panelists, you guys were wonderful. Thank you. So this is a bit of a last question for Dr. Juliette. Could you give us a take-home message from here today from all what we've learned so far? Thank you.
It's going to be really hard because there's just been this, I've just found the last couple of hours absolutely inspiring. And I really, really wish that when I was a young researcher, I'd had, all this sort of, really fantastic, very sort of honest and open sharing of experiences of working at the Science Policy Interface. But I think that for me, the take-home message is an incredibly positive one, which is that actually, now compared to when I started working on this, there are a huge amount more sort of tools and strategies and approaches that we can actually use to get to know the policy world better and become more engaged in it. And I just think that that's fantastic. And I love this idea of fellowships and internships and, sort of really building that knowledge of the policy world early so that you can really, in the rest of your career, have that grounding and really, be more engaged in science policy interfaces. And I think my take-home message would really just be that, if you do want to get involved in science policy interfaces, it's possible, it's encouraged, there's lots of stuff out there to help and support and share experiences. And I think this last point is a really, really key one I'd like to finish on. Really this idea of sharing experiences, good and bad, because we can learn as well from really difficult experiences of engaging in the science policy interface. But I would really, and this is why I think your two networks are so fantastic, because they're really fora in which you can exchange your experiences and really build on them and work together, supporting each other in engaging with the science policy interface. So that would be my take-home message from this. And thank you for organizing this. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so very much. That was a good one there. So for early career researchers, we will keep in mind that we need to share our information and share our knowledge. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And there was actually one interesting question from Andre, but I think I missed it. But it's actually to all the panelists. He's talking about the reward system in academia. I mean, how will the early career scientists be encouraged to get involved in science policy work? I mean, what's going to change in the academia landscape to encourage this kind of shift in maybe the mindset of early career researchers on their involvement in science policy? So I think we can all just go through the panelists. You can have one minute each before we round up the Q&A section. Thank you.
Yeah, I just typed in an answer to that. I wasn't sure if we were going to get a chance to answer it. I think it's a really important question. What I'd say is, and you can look at that answer, we have done some research on this across a couple of thousand researchers that are involved in some way with science and policy. And it's true that the perception of the importance of these kinds of activities at the science policy interface is much greater than the perception of rewards across most institutions. And so this is a paper in 2019 in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. Now, at the same time, I actually think that, so that suggests that there's a need for much more kind of reward for these activities. I think that even since that interview, that series of surveys that we did, I think that things have actually changed and that there's an even greater appreciation of the importance for these kinds of activities. But I think that it is actually largely driven by the fact that these activities are increasingly yielding research publications, right? And publications that are kind of crossover between research and policymaking about the science policy interface. And I think that's both good and also somewhat problematic, because, we're still relying on that old metric to measure important engagement at this interface. And it's not a perfect measure of that, but better than nothing.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kerr. So I don't know if I saw a lot of the panelists nodding in agreement, so I don't know if anyone wants to add one.
And I would just like to reemphasize that to me, that's the most important question that we should have posed at the beginning, because it's a whole event altogether, the question of incentives. And I'm very curious to see this paper, Kai, because we are discussing, I don't think we have all the answers, but that's a constant, we need to put more pressure. It's about funders, it's about our structures in academia. It's of course altogether that I think is changing a little bit, but it's still, we're not far. But to me also, one thing that I didn't have time to address, and it's very important, I think at the beginning, Ingunn, you mentioned that it's not always easy to be there as an early research career and presenting your difficult, complex research to very senior people, but you can only measure also for women how even more difficult it is. And we tend to forget, and I do think we need more diversity in this science policy dialogue, and completely out of my own experience and how not easy it is to navigate the systems. And that's one of the things that we're also doing at the Women Leaders for Planetary Health. It's breaking the silos, because it's about gender, it's about health, it's about environment all together. And we also launched a mentorship focusing on empowering women from the global south, where we see the least support in this area. So we're really helping women to not only know more about biodiversity, about climate change, but it's about advocacy skills, about negotiation skills, about the power of your own story. Why do you even want to do this? Why do you want to make a change? Understanding all that, I think it's a really important tool that it's not written in a paper, and I think it's very important. So I would invite you all also to connect with us. Women at all ages from everywhere, but we've just started a mentorship program where we have 20 countries represented, and I'm very curious to see how this will develop. And so thank you very much. Also, congratulations for organizing this panel. It was very inspiring, and I hope we need to continue this dialogue in other channels. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just jump in here? Right,
yes.
Nicole, yeah, thank you. And Nicole, looks forward to reading more about your exciting program there. And yes, gender is definitely an issue that is up every year when we have our training courses and meetings between the fellows, because there are challenges with gender. There's working interdisciplinary, but also working when you sit in your own home office in the different countries, and we've seen that now with COVID as well, even more, but with IPBES, most of the work is actually done from your home desk. And then you interact with all your chapter co-authors on either Skype or Teams or whatnot, and that provides challenges. And then you have the challenges with coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, and maybe not even among you talking the same language, and then you have to agree on a language that you're going to present to the policymakers as well. So there are a lot of challenges, and sharing those experiences and well, I did it this way, maybe that can help you. It's really, really useful. So back to that first question that I also think is a very important one on how do we post that actually to our fellows, like, so why did you apply here? Doing something else might have gotten you further in the academic world quicker, etc. And what our fellows that have been through the whole cycle now are telling us is that, you know, I would not have changed this for at all if I had started again. This has been a life-changing experience. I've met more people, more senior people, people that I have been reading their articles, that I have looked up to in just the first author meeting that you go to, and you're introduced to all these your heroes, right? That you've been reading about and that you've seen, and just being able to connect with them. One fellow told me it would have taken me years to get that network. And by being part, and then we have examples of fellows that are working, they're writing scientific papers, they're publishing in Science and in other really great journals. So I would just encourage you, it's really rewarding on a personal level, but also on an academic level as well, to take part. And it's important for the world. So thank you from me.
Yes, and so I wanted to add something to what Ingunn said. So I'm, as was mentioned earlier by Ingunn, I'm an IPBES fellow, and so I guess for me the challenge earlier was that when I was a postdoc in a previous lab, I my professor, who was also an IPBES author actually, would not cover my IPBES work, so I had to take vacation leaves just to join IPBES. Anyway, now I'm in a different workplace, and my current workplace actually allows me to use my work days to join IPBES. So this is something that you could also consider in the future. Of course, I know it's difficult to find a job, but when you discuss with your future boss or your future professors, it would be great if you could bring this up if you're interested to join, to be engaged in the science policy interface, to ask them, would you be willing to support me? Can I have work days engage in this? And because I must tell you, I mean, a minimum of, I think, 10 days, right, Ingunn? Because we have the author meeting and then we have the fellows meeting. So easily you can have 10 days of your vacation leave for that if your professor.
I'll clarify. So actually we ask for everyone to get a letter from their employer to say that you can spend 15% of your time on IPBES. And that's important, just to avoid the case that Denise ended up in. And I think, well, it's an unfortunate case, and luckily it doesn't happen very often. But having that employer verify that you can spend 15% of your time, it's important. And it's for traveling. Of course, it will vary. Some weeks you will not do much work, but some weeks it's only IPBES work. So, and I'm sure Kai can can sign off on that.
Yes. So anyway, I'm out of I'm now in a new institute. So, and the new institute really values that I'm in IPBES. And so for everyone who's interested in SPI, this is something that you have to think of. Yeah.
Okay, on that note, we're going to end this very informative panel discussion. So it's to say a big thank you on behalf of the WABES project and on behalf of YEARS. We want to say thank you to all the panelists and thank you to all the participants for joining us in this lively discussions around linking science and policy for the sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. So if you have any questions or still have some comments, so you just feel free to send us an email at info@wabes.net or yesnetwork.org@gmail.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Stay safe.
Again. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Stay safe. Yeah,
Bye.
thank you very much.